So good afternoon to all of you here in the room and to those who follow online. Welcome to our reading seminar, a Belgian policy framework for best value biological medicines, how to move forward, presented by Dr. Yannick Vandenplas, who actually is an I3h alumni. I'm very proud to present him here. And he defended his PhD 6 months ago, in September at KU Leuven. His promoter is Isabelle Heus, who is also, who was my promoter. That's why we are acquainted. And he's now a health economist consultant at Hict. He will present to us, he did research on the Belgian policy framework, the incentives, and how, all the biologic drugs, which include vaccines, blood and blood samples or blood components, allergenics, somatic cells, gene therapy, tissues, recombinant therapeutic proteins, and biosimilars, how we can incentivize the uptake of biosimilars and what doesn't work, because apparently after reading his two background articles on the Belgian markets and policy environment of patent biologicals, there are some issues and challenges, and he will present this to us today. Yannick kindly said that if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them, raise your hands online, or put your questions in the Q&A, and we will give you the floor to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the invitation to speak here, everyone online and everyone in this room. Thank you so much for the interest. So indeed, as Hilde has already introduced very well, I'm going to talk about the results in general of my PhD project, which was a policy framework for best value biological medicines in Belgium. A little bit of background on this. This was a project that I did at the KU Leuven, closely in collaboration with Hict, which is our national health insurer. They were also the sponsor of the PhD project, so it was really there. They initiated the PhD project at the very beginning. The work that I'm doing right now as a health economics consultant, in fact, is not related to what I'm going to present here. This is completely the work at KU Leuven of the past 4 years. So in general, I would like to introduce the concept of biological medicines. I assume that most of you will already know or a little bit familiar with what are biological medicines in general, but I would like to introduce some interesting concepts here just to get the topic going. So what is important on biological medicines? They are produced by living organisms or living cells. This is completely different compared to chemical or traditional chemical medicines, like, for example, Dafalgan, as we all know, paracetamol is a molecule which is chemically synthesized. Biological is not. It's produced by living cells or living organisms. They are larger, they're more complex compared to chemically synthesized molecules. As you can already see here on the left-hand side, as already mentioned, we have paracetamol, very simple in chemical structure. Right-hand side, biological medicine, in this case, a monoclonal antibody, completely different in structure, way more complex, way larger also. If you place them next to each other, this is not even correct, it would be way smaller compared to the antibody on the right-hand side. Some examples may be also interesting to know here, as already,
Sorry to ask a question. So,
no, go ahead.
I know that initially it was very much more complex to produce.
Yes.
Now, is it something standardized?
I think they got more and more delivery with the production process. In the beginning, I know that there were some issues, especially with antibodies, for example, which are more complex to produce compared to hormones like apoetin or filgrastim. I think most companies are really acquainted with how to do that now. Although I have to mention that, for example, in terms of biosimilar production, there are some biosimilars like damepoetin, which is a long-acting epoetin. There, the producers have issues to make a good biosimilar. So it still can happen.
That's exactly why I was asking. Thanks.
So some examples. So as already mentioned, we have the typical monoclonal antibodies mainly used in immunology or oncology also. We have also vaccines. We have insulins for diabetic patients. Those are all typical examples of biologicals. And of those categories, there are also biosimilars on the market. And one of the main issues also is that on biological medicines, in general, they have a higher price. It's not always the case, of course, but in general, they have a higher price compared to traditional medicines, which places a large burden on healthcare budgets, especially when they're used a lot, like insulins, for example, or antibodies for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. A lot of patients, not only in Belgium, but on a global level as well. There's a lot of pressure on healthcare budgets. And I want to dig into this a little bit further and also to provide some perspective on what do we mean by pressure of healthcare budgets. If we have an overall healthcare budget in Belgium, these are Belgian figures that I will mention here, then approximately 17% of this is going to pharmaceuticals in Belgium, and approximately a third is spent on biologicals. If we look at this a little bit further, so we have a third in 2021, this is approximately the same today. In 2010, we only had 23% on biological spending, and in the future, it is expected that we will go in the same direction. Towards 2030, it should be a lot higher. Also important mentioning here is these are, of course, relative figures. If you look at absolute figures, it would be, of course, increasing, even though here this is a relative figure compared to the overall pharmaceutical spending. Also, a few numbers for Belgium. I think it's interesting to say that in Belgium, we have an overall healthcare budget of approximately 35 billion euros. 5.9 is on pharmaceutical and 2.1 are spent on biologicals. But of course, and I think some of them already should appear to you, we have an aging population. There are more and more complex molecules coming to the market. We have the emergence of gene therapy, for example, more personalized treatments, also pandemics. Unfortunately, it happens. It can also happen again. We never know. There are a lot of challenges that would put pressure on healthcare budgets in the future. I will take a little step back here to mention or to more, let's say, emphasize and explain what I'm going to talk about today. So we've had overall healthcare budget, we've had what are biological medicines, how are they related in Belgium. Now I'm going to talk about the off-patent segment of the market, what does that mean, and how are we going to make the link towards biosimilars as well. If I present to you very high-level overview, I know a lot of details are lacking here of a typical life cycle of new medicines. We know we have the R&D phase, we have market approval for biological. This is at the level of the European Medicines Agency and the European Commission. Afterwards, pricing and reimbursement in Belgium, mainly Public Service for Economics and also Finani. And afterwards, if all these different phases succeed, which is a lot of the often not the case, then the commercialization part starts. And we are interested within this presentation in the commercialization parts. If we look, for example, in this case, on biological medicines, and we see in the beginning, we have a monopoly phase. This is due to patents or due to regulatory exclusivities by the European Commission, lasts for approximately 10 to 12 years in the case of biological medicines. And afterwards, competition is allowed into the market, meaning competition of the same kind of product, which is a similar version in this respect. So we have an originator biological, receives competition after 10 to 12 years, or again receive competition after 10 to 12 years from a biosimilar product. So what are biosimilars? Very briefly, it's also a biological medicine. It's a version of the originator biological. We must say it's a version. It's not an identical copy. That's simply not possible. But in the clinical trials, they have proven to be to have the same efficacy, same quality, and the same safety. Also, same mechanism of action is an important condition to be a biosimilar. And they have a similar structure, as already mentioned, not identical copy. It's not needed either if you can prove that you have clinical equivalence.
When you say it's not identical, it's not possible, what do you mean by it's not possible?
Yeah, because the complex structure of a biological medicine, there are a lot of, there's a primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure of typical proteins. It's not possible to make an identical copy, even between batches of biological medicines of the same product. It's also not possible to have an identical copy or identical molecular copy of the first, let's say, original version.
Because in general, when we defend the patent system, we say that you grant exclusivity against this full disclosure of the new thing. So here, full disclosure is not full.
That's
true.
Yeah,
it's not the fault of the originator, it's the fault of biology. Because the question is, how do you, as an economist, I'm always thinking about people gaming the system. What if it's not an issue that you don't disclose everything and then you hit it hard down the line
It's indeed, I think that's one of the main challenges also for biosimilar companies indeed to make an identical copy. Sorry, it's simply not possible because that's not it's just inherent to biological medicines. Even if you have all information, and even then it will not be possible to produce exactly the same molecule. It's also not needed. You can prove that it's the same. That there is just like an inherent variability between biological medicines. But it's true indeed that not a full disclosure of the production process in the patent either. That's true.
But it's not seen as an issue.
No, in general not. If you can prove at a clinical level that there is no that there are no clinical differences, then it's not an issue anymore. It should not be an issue.
So coming to that, what's the difference in procedure versus small molecule? So small molecules, you have generics. This is pretty standardized. For biosimilars, as far as I understand, it's still very complex, so the cost of entering the market would be very different.
Yes, that's true. There are indeed some differences. Let's say 5 to 10 years ago, I would say, in general, biosimilar medicines, they have to do a phase 3 study. Phase 1, phase 2 is usually skipped. Phase 3, they have to do a comparative study to the original biological. Generics don't have to do that. They just have to do a bioequivalent study. It's usually phase 1 study as well. So that's already a big difference in terms of that clinical package that they have to do. It will last some years for biosimilar to prove, sort of to conduct a phase 3 study. For generics, they will be faster. They will have less costs for their production. For their development process. Indeed, so it will be shorter. However, I have to say that today there is this tendency, especially for less complex biologicals, to also skip the phase 3. There are some on the market. Yeah.
EU level or Belgium level?
Both. Yeah, there are biologicals now. I think especially in, I'm not sure which one, but especially in the hormones, there are some that did not or that get a waiver from the European Medicines Agency to not conduct.
And then it's automatically recognized by all 27.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And the size of the phase 3 clinical study for biosimilars is much smaller than for the generics. If they would have, well, it's only bioequivalence.
Yeah, it's usually indeed bioequivalence. That's the thing that the generic has to do. Of course, biosimilar has to do that as well. But they will have to do clinical studies on patients as well. So not only healthy subjects, it will be larger. It will have more effort. Also here, if a biosimilar company or producer conducts a phase 3 study, it's also not the same, of course, as the originator biological, for example, TNF alpha inhibitor like adalimumab. They have to do the trials in rheumatoid arthritis, in IBD, they have psoriasis, I think also several indications. The biosimilar only has to do it in one sensitive indication. They have to provide a good substantiation, of course, why that is a sensitive indication. It's a whole process that is well established, but they do not have to replicate each different subgroup. And I would like to mention here also, because indeed it's something complex, and I also think it's a different paradigm compared to new originator biologicals. Then we have to say that after I think now 15 years of biosimilars on European markets, there are no issues with biosimilars that have had their market introduction or that have had their market approval by the European Commission. There are no issues with biosimilars being retracted from the market because they do not have enough safety or not enough efficacy. So the process at the EMA level is proven to be robust. So the system, it works. There's no issue there. As already mentioned, so if we have competition in the market, that's what we want. Biosimilar versus off-patent versus maybe second generation products. I will get into that later on. Why do we need that, or why, in this case, as you've asked KOL to research this, there are several reasons for this. Competition leads to more and faster access. It can be that if the biological becomes lower priced, it can be put earlier into the treatment line, so patients can have access to biologicals faster than it was before patent expiry or before competition into the markets. Competition can also deliver, for example, new injection devices. There are examples of biosimilars that have better injection devices, more favorable for patients, less painful injections. There are some examples of this. Can also be the originator that let's say improves their own injection device because competition has come to the market. So it's in both ways. Also lower risk of shortages. It's more a theoretical risk, I have to say, because I'm not really aware of typical biological medicines that went out of stock in the past couple of years. But it is still, if you have more suppliers on the market, there is less risk of shortages, if any would go out of stock, or interruptions in their supply chain, for example.
Production is more European.
Usually, yes. Can also be, I think now most companies, especially the newer biosimilars, there is the strength of these Asian companies. They don't have European production even, but it's a change in lens. And as already mentioned, the fact that biosimilars introduce price competition into the market, it leads to more sustainably financed healthcare systems, simply because more savings are being generated and they have more room to finance other things, like, for example, innovative medicines. So there is more room to finance other technologies in the markets. This can not only, because usually, and that's something that we would like to deviate away from. In the past, we've always mentioned biosimilars that generate this, which is of course true. These different typical benefits are not only generated by biosimilars, can also be that the originator lower their price because they have to, or because they want to be a competitive player in the market. They can invent new injection devices. It's not necessarily the biosimilar on its own, it's the whole ecosystem that changes after patent expiry.
So the typical problem with generics is that we don't see the initiator lowering prices that much. They rather try to switch consumers, doctors to new molecules that are very high priced. Do you see better outcomes here with biosimilars?
I think part of it is the same. I have to say, in Belgium we have, and I will get into it later also. In Belgium we have the specific system. I think it's more pronounced than in other countries, that the originator has to lower their price. When a biosimilar comes to the market, they're obliged to get to the same level of the biosimilar. So that's already
By law.
Mandatory thing by law, indeed, in Belgium, that you have to do. The encouragement to go to more expensive products, that's also happening in the biologicals market. That's also one of the problems why the off-patent market becomes smaller.
And what's the pushback from INAMI or for economy?
Sorry?
What is the pushback against that from the authorities?
I'm afraid we've not seen very much on the level of pushbacks. What is being done a little bit more now, also in the past 2 years, is that they change treatment plans. If, for example, an originator, or let's say a second generation product, more expensive product, is available as a first line treatment, and the biosimilar and European products are also as a first line treatment, as soon as they lower their prices, they can become the only first line, and the more expensive products treatment line further away. That's like one of the ideas
and that works,
right? I think in general that should work, but it's to be determined, of course, the size or the extent to which this will work. But it's one of the ideas that is growing at the level of
And on what is it assessed then? Is it on price, biosimilars versus second generation or reformulations if you have a better injection tool? How do you assess this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I was at ISPO earlier this year, which is a health economics conference, and was also one of the topics there. Because indeed, it's difficult then if you have, like, for example, if it's exactly the same, then it's easy. You should only look at price. But if it's a different product, more favorable injection device, let's say, for example, we have also originator products, IV, intravenous administrations, and then the more expensive product is subcutaneously administered. It has some advantage for the hospital and also for the patient. Then, now let's say the guideline is to reevaluate, to do a complete different or new economic evaluation. But in practice in Belgium, I haven't seen that yet. But it's always very difficult, because then you have to also compare yourself to the originator product, which will also need a new trial maybe, or new assessments. I think it might complicate things, but pure from a health economic perspective, you should do it again. You should prove indeed that you are that you have some advantages with the new formulations there, or favorable administration, for example. But in Belgium, I must say there is not many experience at this point in time on these specific assessments, but I know that's one of the ways they are thinking about it, and I must say that from an economic perspective, I agree with that approach. Coming back to the title also of this presentation, which is best value biologicals, it's not been invented by myself. It's not been invented in Belgium either. It's something that has been introduced in 2018 by the NHS in England, because they did not want to mainly push forward biosimilars only. They want to create a full ecosystem where originators can live, between brackets, side by side with biosimilar medicines, and mention it's all about best value biological, the highest value biological that should be promoted here, not necessarily the biosimilar or some other product. So it's more about what offers competition and how can we drive competition into the markets. The problem statement of the whole PhD project was because in Belgium we have, it's more statistical thing here. We have, at that time, I think it might have changed by now, in September, we had 84 approved biosimilar products at the European level, 40 reimbursed in Belgium of 14 different molecules, which means I will not look on the left-hand side, I will look on the right-hand side. The figure between brackets is more interesting. It means that the difference there, which is, yeah, I don't know by heart. In any case, the molecules difference there, those are the products that do not have competition in Belgium. So that's important to know. We have also some signals of colleague researchers of myself within our research units that have already pointed at different signals in the market that things aren't moving, things are going too slow. Biosimilar uptake is slow and low in the past, and there is not, at that point in time, in 2019, when this project started, not much had moved by then, because we already knew that there were problems, but still lack of initiative at the government level.
So your question is why only 14 and not 23?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we should not look at, in my opinion, we should look at like why are we lacking 44 products. That doesn't matter. We don't necessarily need for one molecule 8 biosimilars, but at least 1 or 2. There are also studies on this. How many do you really need? But at least 1, I would say, to have competition.
Even those economists, you would say that what you operate is not that great.
I agree.
It would be better to have 5 firms.
Yeah, I agree. Fully agree. Yeah, that's true. And at that time, indeed, there were some measures already implemented, but they did not work. They did not have any impact. It's also something that we researched. At that time, was like the general idea. We don't think that any of those measures that have been implemented at that time worked. Something that we studied. I will get back to later.
Measures promote entry or to promote competition? So entry of molecules or competition within a molecule? What are you?
Mainly promoting competition, but also just to.
So you want more biosimilars?
Yes, that was the main idea at that time. We want more biosimilars on the market. We want to push biosimilar market shares.
Is it Norway that is a leader there?
No, in general, the Scandinavian countries are doing very well. It's true.
So why don't we benchmark on them?
Sorry?
Why don't we benchmark on them?
That's a good question. We've also looked into that. They have a lot of policy measures in place in the past couple of years. They've done a lot. For example, what they do is, I think they have a different approach. They do national tenders. They do national tenders at the molecular level. For example, they write a tender. It's on the national level. It's not at the hospital level. Single winner, biosimilar or originator, they can all compete, and that one molecule is being used for a certain amount of time, which is, in my opinion, a very strong way to do it, but it's also a difficult way to do it because it locks competition for a certain period of time, unfortunately, for that molecule. So it might work in Scandinavian countries, but in Belgium, it's difficult to copy paste, I would say. It's also one of the conclusions that it's difficult just to copy paste measures of countries where things seem to work. I think we have to look at them and learn from them as well. But copy pasting, it always depends on the healthcare system itself. In Belgium, we tender at the hospital level for hospital products. For ambulatory care products, we do it it's just delivered to the community pharmacy.
I would like to keep discussing the methods, but maybe not now when you feel the time is right.
Yeah, and we will also get back to it in those different things. So the point was that indeed the Belgian policy framework was needed. I will go a little bit quicker on this. In general, we had 4 larger objectives of the PhD project, and it was because we saw 4 different problems or lack of knowledge on certain elements. We knew that the market didn't work in Belgium. We didn't know exactly what didn't work or why things didn't work, especially the why, something that we didn't know by then. The patient perspective was at that point lacking. We knew that patients have, of course, they must have opinions, they must have discussions with their physicians, but we didn't really know Is that important? Is that something that influences competition in the market or preferences towards certain molecules? Those are things that we simply didn't know at that point in time. Prescribing choices were still unclear. Coming back to the point that was already raised, there is a part of the market that is being decided on the level of the tender of the hospital. Another part is still at the prescribing physician that can make the decision for a certain molecule. Those are the molecules delivered in the ambulatory care. So it's a part of the market. It's not the whole market. But at that point, we didn't really know what drives prescribing choices here. That's something that we looked into, and also, as already mentioned, the impact of previous measures, also something that we didn't know by then. So this leads to different objectives. I will not go into detail here. It will become clear later on. The purpose was to study the Belgian market landscape, to look at how can we build trust among Belgian patients and what information is lacking, for example, to understand decision-making among Belgian clinicians. And also, in general, we ended up with, we put forward a framework policy perspective in Belgium.
So why trust among patients and not among prescribers?
Because at that point in time, we already knew some about this. There were some studies already being conducted, and already at that time, we knew that there are issues indeed also at the prescriber level. It's not something that we duplicated here. We also looked at this in the beginning in terms of interviews with physicians and stakeholders. How is, for example, the attitude of physicians toward biosimilars evolving? But at that time, there was already quite some knowledge on the Belgian level. And in general,
so your claim is you need patients separately. Because I go there, the doctor tells me what I need to know. I know nothing, right? So
that's true. That's true. And I think I will get into it later also. But it's also important to know what kind of discussion do they have with their physicians, because, for example, we know that also at physician level, and that's something that we studied at the part number 3. Physicians just mentioned also like, yeah, we have a lot of patients that do not want a biosimilar. That's the reason why I do not prescribe it. So then we would like to know, okay, why is this?
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So this leads to several studies. I will get into most of them, a little bit more in detail on some, a bit less in others. To the first one, the first part was where we studied the Belgian market landscape. It's also one of the articles that I've provided you. What we did there is that we, first of all, we analyzed Belgian market data at the level of INAMI between 2013 and 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And we also had discussions with several stakeholders. We discussed with healthcare providers, with, of course, policymakers, with the industry, with patients, with insurers. We discussed with several people to, after we analyzed the market data, to understand why things are happening in the market. We did not only look at biosimilars and originators, we also looked at those shifts in needs towards more expensive products. We also asked market data on these different products. We had 3 main conclusions here. The first one was still that the market is being dominated by originator molecules. This can be the off-patent originator, can also be the more expensive one, I would say. You know, this was the point number 2, that we also see shifts happening from off-patent molecules towards newer alternatives. It depends from class to class to what extent this is happening, but in general, we see this trend where it's possible to have a more expensive product if being used.
And the new alternatives, are those developed by the originator company or by new?
Good question. In general, yes. Mostly, it's a competitive technique, of course, of originator companies, and it's not forbidden either. That, for example, if I have for trastuzumab is one example that I have in my mind now. The intravenous product was on the market by a similar competition for the intravenous version. But at the moment, the biosimilar came to the market at the European level or at the global level. Then they developed, or they did not develop, they entered into the market as a cutaneous version, which was a little bit more expensive. A little bit, yeah. Of course, there are advantages here for the patient and for the hospital, so you can discuss about this. But still, we see that there was a large shift the moment biosimilars entered the market. That part of the market, intravenous part of the market, shrank. So it's often the same company. It's not always the same company, but it's often the same company. In insulin, there's also a typical example here where shorter acting versions and longer acting versions are developed or marketed, sorry, not side by side, but after the first version has come to the market. And then when off-patent products come to the market, or when the patent expires, and they come with a longer acting version, for example, or a more concentrated version, which has some benefit. There are some proven benefits here, of course, but still we see large shifts happening, and it's always the discussion also here. How many patients would really need, let's say, a newer version, and how many can still benefit from the older version? That's the question. It's difficult to answer. But it's a general trend that we saw, and an also interesting one, which comes back to one of the questions already, is that we see a lack of price competition in the off-patent biologicals market. I have to mention two things here. First of all, it's being one of the main reasons here why we don't see price competition is we have only list prices in Belgium. So the analysis here is done on list prices. In ambulatory care markets, that's okay because that's the net price also. In the hospital market, that's a problem because competition is mainly happening at the level of the tender, confidential prices in hospitals. So the real price competition is something that we do not see. That's a logical thing. But still, at the level of our health insurer, is Finami, they put their reimbursement basis on the level of list prices. So it's also relevant to look at what's happening on the level of the list price. It does not change much. And if it changes because the government mandates to lower prices, not because of healthy competition.
Because when you say the lack of price competition due to mandatory price reduction, so you're saying if the mandatory price reduction is big enough, then there is no further room, and that's okay.
That's true. That's true.
What we don't really care about the extent to which there is price competition. We care about the price in the end.
It's true. But two remarks. First, in hospital level, we see that prices, I'm not saying that prices should go to the bottom. The prices can go lower because we know from hospitals that on the net price level at the hospital, they go a lot lower, over 50% at the confidential level. In the ambulatory market, there, a colleague of mine did some comparisons in other countries, similar countries like France, Germany, Netherlands. On ambulatory prices, how are they different in our neighboring countries? They're, on general, a lot lower. So there must be room.
So lack of price competition due to mandatory price reduction, which unfortunately are insufficient, so prices are too high.
True.
What you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one point from teaching economics. If you allow for price discrimination, you make some people pay a high price and then may sell at the marginal costs for the next, maybe some hospitals, because you can at least recover the cost of innovation entering the markets, phase 3 trials, etc., from the other one. So this comparison is not doesn't imply that you may have everybody at a lower price. The reaction may be that the lowest price increases. That's why Canada doesn't want to be a benchmark for the US, for instance. It would kill their low price.
That's true, indeed. Yeah, it should always be. It's very difficult indeed to compare countries as well because it's different systems, and indeed, as you mentioned, you should also take into account. I'm not really a fan. It's also one of the things in the end of creating a sustainable market. You should not go to the lowest price possible because that also kills the system. So it should be a balance. I agree. Yeah. In the second part of the first study part, I would say, of the PhD. We also looked into barriers for a more competitive market. So on the one hand side, we looked at what happens into the markets on basis of market data, but also with interviews, I already mentioned, but we also looked at why are these things happening, what is going wrong. In general, at the hospital level, that's the sign on the left-hand side, those are the hospital products. Suboptimal tendering, at that time, some things have changed today. There is new legislation a couple of months ago that was implemented here for off-patent biologicals. But at that time, one of the problems was that, for example, tendering contracts last too long. It lasts too long before competition is re-allowed into the market. It's also tendering criteria were often not very balanced. For example, if you ask for a certain amount or a certain number of years market experience, then you already discriminate by a similar version, of course. They cannot show these data. The originator product is already on the market for 10 years, biosimilar is new on the market. If you ask this as a criterion, then discriminatory to some extent. So those were problems at that time. Also, the hospital financing in Belgium, it's not really the scope of this, was not really the scope of this project, but it was just very important here to mention that if we see, for example, shifts happening into the hospital market, one of the reasons that hospital pharmacists mentioned this was, yeah, okay, this product is often reimbursed to a higher extent. It's more expensive. The government gives us more money back when we purchase this product. So it creates, yeah, it has economical benefits for the hospital financing system in Belgium as well, which was already having difficulty at that time, especially during COVID. This was even, yeah, I would say, yeah, to some extent increased. For ambulatory products, there is still a question mark there for unavailable biosimilars, because at that time, a lot of people told us, yeah, it's not always the case that when we prescribe a biosimilar, it's really available at the community pharmacy. To be honest, I was a little bit skeptical on this. That's why I put a question mark, because I didn't really receive any signals. If you look at Factor site, for example, that is really the case, right? There might be a problem, but at that time, we were skeptical on this argument. I don't think that indeed biosimilars are unavailable at the community pharmacy level. Also, if you ask this to biosimilar developers at that time, they were not aware about this. So, but still, there must be some reason why people mentioned it at that time. Lack of incentive in general to prescribe biosimilars, because in ambulatory care market, the prescribing physician that makes the decision here. We often heard the argument that why should I change my prescribing? There is a lot of effort in explaining patients that they will have a new injection device, for example. I get nothing in return. The patient does not get any benefits. Why should I do that? So that was really a problem at that point. And I think still today to come. And then lastly, some overarching barriers, as already mentioned, shifts towards newer products, lack of trust in biosimilars was something that was already mentioned at that point. Physicians on the one hand side, but also patients. Managed entry agreements, and at that point was not very much in the off-taking segment, but there are examples of biological medicines which were under managed entry agreements for so long that at the point biosimilar can come to the market, they did not know at which price, because it was still under a contract in Belgium, as we say. Mandatory price reductions, I think that's at this point this was really a problem, because their biosimilars have issues to provide a competitive advantage. Like, for example, if an originator biological is already on the market, you come as a biosimilar, you join the market, you have to lower your prices both to the same level. At that point, the biosimilar does not have any volume yet, so it's difficult to even further lower at that time. They do not have any volume guarantees. In other countries, if you have, for example, quota, prescribed quota, where you already know, I will get 40% of the market, at least some part will be mine. So you can make some estimations on, I can go below the price of the originator. In Belgium, that's a problem. At least this was the industry perspective at that time.
And from the data I've seen, we have the same problem with generics in Belgium.
Yes.
Where there is general distrust of copies. I don't know if it's fake news or if there is a reason, but
yeah, one of the things that I've indeed heard a lot, especially in the beginning when I was doing this research, is that policymakers told me, we've seen this for generics, the story is coming back all over again. I think it's partly, it's very difficult to scientifically prove this, what I'm going to say now, but I think there was some indeed, negative news fueled by maybe partly industry, maybe partly physicians as well. I think that's also something that we've seen in other countries as well. But I would say that indeed it's a problem because trust is one of the things that you need to have.
And in terms of incentives, if you force the originator to price at the same level as the biosimilar, you're basically destroying the market for the biosimilar.
Fully agree.
So this competition actually kills competition.
Yes, I agree. Indeed, that's the main issue.
So the biosimilar is not allowed to cut the price.
They can go lower. They can go lower. They can, but the problem is that if they come to the market and they are usually, that's what we heard in interviews, they are usually willing to go lower, but they know that they will go to no market share at all. So going lower has some consequences for them as well. And it's usually what we see also in other countries, as mentioned, that they go, okay, the market works here, I can go lower, I will save my profits. But in Belgium, that's a problem because we know that in Belgium that it will be difficult as a biosimilar to get your part of the market.
Isn't it in Germany when they say if the price is lower, this is what you have to prescribe?
I'm not sure whether it's in Germany, but there are indeed in the Netherlands, they're also doing that to some extent. That indeed there is like this discriminatory reimbursement. There's a better term in Dutch for this by heart, but indeed that you get
I would call it
prioritized.
I would call it fair.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah, I think
Because the big problem is that neither the prescriber nor the customer pays. Then that market.
I think the main problem, it's also a question that I had a couple of months ago of an health economist in Hungary, if I'm not mistaken, because there they also put forward this thing of let's say preferential listing. That's what that that the cheapest products get listed, get reimbursed, all the others do not. It creates competition, but it's I think one of the main risks. And something that we observe also in more Balkan countries is that this really creates a problem of going to the lowest price possible. You're only looking at price. You should be looking at more elements also. It can be that the biosimilar is not the cheapest, but has the best injection device, something that you do not cover if you only look at price. So I agree that it can create competition, but it also can create difficulties. In the second part,
You're supposed to fix that.
sorry?
You're supposed to fix that with the tendering design.
Fully agree. Indeed, that's one of the things that we also put forward. If you create fair tenders with good criteria that are scored at the right in the right way, then indeed you can cover that. That's true. But in Belgium, it's one of the problems also. I think now it's changing. I have to say that the landscape has changed a little bit, but in the past it's mainly price the determining factor. Other elements might be important, but it's mainly the price that determines the choice. And for some products, I think that's okay. There are very minor differences for intravenous products, for example. It's difficult to prove additional benefits besides price. It's usually there can be some difference in the solution, for example, for the hospital pharmacy. So there are some. But then indeed for intravenous products, they only look at price. I think it might be it's fair point.
But you can go ahead.
In the second part, we looked at the patient perspective. We did two things. We some surveys in collaboration with Belgian patient associations in those treatments areas or in those disease areas where biosimilars are on the market. So it's an important thing to mention here. We collaborate with them. We send questionnaires on what information is needed. How do you see biosimilars? Would you be willing to change, for example? So such kind of things. In the first part here, we looked at the scientific literature on what are best practices to inform patients and to let's say to make shared decisions for biosimilars, for example.
If I remember well, you had 14 biosimilars on the market in Belgium. For how many indications is that?
I don't dare to say figure here. A little bit more, I would say. That's difficult. In my opinion, there are three main areas. There is oncology, a lot of different sub-indications there. There is immunology, there is typical rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, IBD, and there is insulins, which is also an important one. And the growth hormones is a separate category. I would say they're also mainly used in oncology. Some sub-indications here as well, but mainly oncology. But in oncology, there's quite a list. But now I have to say that this is something new. At the point that I defended my thesis, it wasn't there yet. We also have first biosimilars for ophthalmology, which is a large patient group, for diabetic macular edema, for example. Lucentis, the thing that also came to the news quite sometimes, has also now biosimilar competition. So it's a new area, very recent. Yeah, but the total number of indications might be over 20, but it's several big areas.
Did you do a randomized control experiment? Randomly following some patients, but not others?
No, it was the first political sampling, as we call it. So we collaborated with patient associations, and we indeed asked them on are you willing to collaborate or to do our survey. So it's indeed that's a good invitation of the study as well, because at some points we are at selection bias with the patients. Completing the questionnaire might have some opinions before it.
So I don't know whether it would have been ethically allowed to do a randomized control experiment. It could be interesting to see the impact of reform.
Yeah, I agree. There are some experiments in other countries where they make like this kind of simulation experiments, where they ask patients on where there are different videos, for example, where patients are, one physician explains it in a very positive way, biosimilars are the same, blah, blah, blah. And in another video, the physician says, I have some doubts, would you still agree? So, you know, those kind of experiments, those exist. But still then, usually they are underpowered, I would say. Those experiments are super interesting, but usually they're very small sample sizes. So in the first part, we looked at the literature as well. How can we inform patients in a better way? 5 main things came out of this. First of all, and I think most of them will be logical, so I will not really stand still here a lot. Information has to be understandable. We have to speak with one voice. This means that all different stakeholders, as we call them, being patient associations, physicians, pharmacists, those are the main ones that patients talk to. They have to talk about biosimilars in the same way. It should not be that the physician says, I have some doubts, and the pharmacist says, it should be great, there should be no problem. It should be aligned, because then you create doubts. The information should be positive, and this is there are some experiments, as already briefly touched upon, where even if you try it, where they implemented a communication strategy where they talk about biosimilars in a positive way. They also did not, and they just checked how many patients would be willing to change to a biosimilar, and you see that percentage be willing to switch is a lot higher when you talk about them in a positive way. And information should also be tailored. This means that not every disease is the same, but also not every patient is the same. Some patients will simply agree with the decision of a physician. Others will add questions, might have heard some information of their patients, or social media can be different ways in which they have concerns or ask for more information. Supportive material is also something that has been done a lot, I think, and there are some very good examples. The European Medicines Agency, for example, has made very good videos in different languages, Dutch included, on what are biosimilars, very more cartoony kind of way of really explaining to patients in a layman language what are biosimilars, why are they on the market, who should you go to when you have questions, those kind of things. I think that helps a lot. And second part that we did here was more ad hoc, because in the beginning it was really part of this study, but it was very interesting to do. We scanned members of the European Patient Forum and also the Alliance of Patient Organizations. Those are umbrella organizations and patient organizations globally, but also at the European level. We looked at which kind of patient organizations do have information online on biosimilars, and also what kind of information is there, how is it presented, what's the quality, what's the tone, is it positive, is it negative, is it neutral, those kind of things. We looked at that. We scanned close to 160 organizations, and at that time, 16 disseminated information on biosimilars, mainly being in the indication, of course, where biosimilars are available, in treatment areas where biosimilars are available. I would not say that the 16 is a low number, because there are only kind of treatment areas or a limited number of treatment areas where biosimilars are available. It makes no sense that, for example, the Organization for Alzheimer's Disease shows information on biosimilars. It's not within their field, so it's limited towards some treatment or disease areas. We saw some leading examples, being, for example, Digestive Cancers Europe. They have a lot of information on their website, very well developed brochures, videos. You know, there's a lot on there. But we also have seen some negative examples, and we were surprised to see that some organizations talk about biosimilars in a negative way. They even disencourage them on their website. So we were surprised on this, and it was very interesting to see that there's not only so much information out there, but that the quality or tone in which information is formulated differs so much. So one of the conclusions there was that we believe that they should not develop those information on their own. They should look at collaborations with scientific associations, for example, or academia, like things that we've seen for let's say, the better examples. They co-developed brochures with physician organizations, for example. And in the patient perceptions part, so coming back to the survey that we did for Belgian patients, close to 700 patients collaborated with us and filled in our questionnaires in a variety of therapeutic areas. 4 main conclusions. So first of all, a lack of knowledge does exist, which is not necessarily a problem, I would say. It's not necessary to know everything about the medicine that you might be prescribed in the future. It's not sure that they will be prescribed with a biosimilar in the future, but it's something that we saw. However, there is a large willingness to transition to biosimilars. We asked in the beginning of the questionnaire, are you being treated with an originator biological right now? And to that part, which was the largest part for Belgium, given the low market shares, we asked, but would you be willing in the future to change? Of course, we gave them an explanation of biosimilars and then asked them again. And most of them are indeed willing to transition to a biosimilar. So this would take away part of the argument that we've heard at that point, physicians telling us our patients do not want it. But in this questionnaire, it wasn't very true. 2 out of 3 said approximately agreed with, I would be willing to switch, but of course I need support from my physician, I need the right explanation, and I need someone to go to if I have concerns or questions. Also important here, we asked on who are the source of information that you would prefer. We asked them, okay, if patients want more information, that's good, but who would you prefer to give you that information on biosimilars? Physicians are the main source of information that they trust or that they want. Pharmacists, academia, and to a smaller extent, patient associations. We also asked, and that was one of the things that I remember very well from the survey. We also asked, do you want information from the Ministry of Health, or Mrs. Dinami, from FAC? At that point, there was the information campaign was out there in 2018 already being developed, where President FAC co-developed a brochure. It was on the radio, was on the website, still exists, also brochures. So they did a large effort there, and I think here we really were astonished that I think the answers on Dinami and Ministry of Health that 1 to 2%. So they do not want information. Even in the open text field, patient pensions, I don't like the sources. I want other sources. I want physicians, pharmacists, and so on.
Did you ask industry?
As one of the sources? Yes, we did. It was lower than 35. I don't know by heart.
Higher than.
Yes, it was. Yes. The government was really at the bottom.
I would report on the slide.
I agree. Yeah.
I can see that both government and industry have a conflict of interest.
Yes, true.
At the same time,
on the other hand side,
I know there are a lot of problems with democracy.
yeah.
What people think of democracy, but I think it's interesting to have the numbers of government versus industry.
Yep.
And I also think it would be interesting to link the level of education of the patients to where he searches for his.
We did
Okay.
in the study, but it's not. Yeah, it did not reach the slide. I would say we did, and there was no significant.
Okay.
We did because in the beginning we asked on the level of education. Yeah.
So
More, I mean, so it's very surprising because when you ask, remember Eric's podcast talking about the Belgian health system and saying that we are average in terms of outcomes relative to the rest of Western Europe. There is one thing where Belgians are very different from the average of Europe. They are very happy with the health system. Partly it's linked to the fact that they have a lot of choice.
Yeah, that's true.
But so they are happy, but they don't connect that to the government.
Interesting. Yeah. But I would indeed say that this was something that really surprised us, and it even strengthened our idea at that time that if the government develops information or reaches out to patients, like we provide information on biosimilars, for example, they should not do this on their own. They should co-develop or work together with physicians mainly, I would say. But they also know about these campaigns that they can help, support. I think that would have been way better. Yeah, it was one of the main learnings of this study. It's always difficult because this was a questionnaire, not an interview. It's difficult to why do they not trust the government in this part, for example? Why is this not preferred?
So what I hear from very interesting facts, but the solutions to me that seems to emerge is that you want an independent commission like the IPCC for climate change, where you have specialized people, physicians, pharmacists, academics, journalists probably, who meet, they evaluate all the evidence and they report with one big report, and that must be the source for all of Europe. Because the rest, if you decentralize true, you have lots of choice, you have lots of voices, but then you can, read the information. If it comes from the government, you have the impression they are trying to sell us on the cheap because they want to save money. My health doesn't matter to them. If it's the producers, okay, they're expensive, but the government pays anyway. At least I get some, So the solution seems to be that one, right? You want this combination of people, but the super specialists, and they impose the source of information to all physicians in Europe, right?
I'm happy that you say that, because indeed, in our recommendations, we need it.
High five.
I can only agree with the explanation of the arguments. That's indeed, yeah, that's true. I fully agree that indeed it should be an independent working group or whatever, how you call it, doesn't really matter. Which has some support of the government, because there should be linked.
Exactly.
But it should be
With a credible independent source, right?
I agree. Yeah.
With monopoly of information in the end.
Yeah, fully agree. To the third part of the PhD project, there we looked at decision making among Belgian clinicians. In general, we looked at what is happening at the prescriber level. We looked at what the term is prescribing, what is happening in terms of the quantitative level, the market data, prescriber level, differences between regions in Belgium, difference between specialisms who prescribe biologicals. And lastly, this comes back also to one of the questions. We also developed a selection making model to support standarding. To look at we looked at what kind of criteria matter if you select an originator biological or a biosimilar. If you face that decision, besides price, and what other elements can you look? I already mentioned injection devices. There are a lot more. We looked also at other differentiating elements. In the first part on prescribing determinants, the main rationale here was we want to look at what drives prescribing decisions, why are choices being made, what are trade-offs being made by physicians. We did it in 4 different steps. So first of all, we did a literature review to identify general prescribing determinants outside of the biologicals landscape. And we asked Belgian physicians. We had 3 different focus groups. We have Belgian physicians on to rank those elements that we identified in the literature. We discussed those with them. We presented them the results of the first ranking, discussed with them, and then came back to the second ranking. So this is called, the Vanilla group technique. It's well known, I think, in the field of qualitative research. So 3 steps: literature, ranking, and then group discussion, and again ranking in the end. The ones that, there was a long list of different prescribing determinants that we found in the literature. Some of them are, in our opinion, most important. We made a cutoff of 3.5. It's based also on other qualitative studies. And those ones, we see them as predominant determinants for prescribing decisions. So the main ones, I will not really look at the exact scoring because the sample size is limited. It's just being used as a cutoff to see what those ones are most important, or those are the ones that we want to investigate more and to look at what is exactly behind the decisions of physicians. So first of all, the preference of key opinion leaders was mentioned a lot also during the focus groups. That, for example, a rheumatologist says to us, yeah, but I also looked at the larger academic centers, what they do there. It's important for us because they need to know what they're doing. I'm doing that also in my hospital. So those are things that we heard a lot. Working environment, mainly being the difference between private hospitals, academic hospitals, or general hospitals. Also some differences there. Patient profile, I think this makes a lot of sense. Some patients, for example, older patients are not always willing to change their therapy. Younger patients usually are more. Those kind of things were mentioned also there, or allergies might also be important. There might be excipients difference, biosimilar versus originator. Those things also matter. Pharmaceutical marketing and promotion is very difficult here to know all the different, I would say, backgrounds here, because physicians are not always willing to talk about every kind of promotion or activities that is happening there. But they acknowledged that it is important. There are some benefits, legal benefits, by the way, given by pharmaceutical companies in terms of marketing and promotion, sponsoring to conferences, support for clinical trials, those kind of things that determines to some extent their choice.
You said illegal?
Legal. No, legal. Very important. Yeah. Of course, those things, I'm not saying biosimilars originator companies are doing this, they're doing this both, but it matters for physicians. Clinical data, of course, and I think those were interesting topics also during the focus groups, because there is this tendency in other countries as well that we should not look anymore or too much at clinical data of biosimilars versus originator products, because it's been evaluated by EMA and you have proven that there is a robust system, that the clinical data, that is fine, the same clinical outcomes, but still physicians to some extent want to see clinical data for biosimilars before they use them, and I think to some extent that's the scientific okay. I think that's a good reflex. But on the other hand side, they also mentioned that the landscape is changing. That usually, maybe in the past, this was a big issue, the lack of clinical trials of biosimilar. But now it's becoming more familiar, and physicians are getting more familiar with the concept of biosimilars and the way they are developed. There's only phase 3, not always, usually phase 3, and also in one sensitive indication. Also, I have to say here that, for example, clinical data, it's more important if you make a decision between different mechanisms of action. If you choose, for example, in rheumatology between an TNF alpha inhibitor, a lot of pockets of patent there, or interleukin inhibitors, also used for the same kind of indications, different mechanism of action. There, of course, the clinical data might become important. Clinical guidelines was I think, a very interesting one as well, because here, usually, clinical guidelines at the European level, for example, they do not make a distinguishment between we prefer an originator product or a biosimilar. They do not mention it. I think that's okay. But some do mention, for example, that you should look at the price and the societal impact of the molecules that you prescribe. So to some extent, it is mentioned in clinical guidelines, but I think for biosimilars versus originators, it's often not very the case that they do make a difference there. Region, I will come back to it later also, because at this point we didn't really know a lot about it. Physicians also mentioned that there are differences between Brussels, Wallonia, and Flanders in biosimilar uptake. At that point, we did not know. I will get into it. We have some figures in it as well. So as already mentioned, depends different mechanism of action for biosimilar versus reference players, which has the same mechanism of action. Then we looked at this from a more quantitative way. We asked for prescribing data at the government. Two main conclusions here, I would say. Slowly increasing biosimilar uptake at that point, 12.9%, which was way below other European countries where we usually compare ourselves to. Austria, Netherlands, France, Germany are a lot higher than this 12.9. And there is a slight difference, and this was very interesting to see between regions, but also between specialisms. Specialisms being so only the ones being prescribed in the ambulatory segment, because at the level of the tender, we do not have those data in Belgium, unfortunately. If you look at the different regions in Belgium, Flanders is indeed a bit higher. There was a difference here between the three regions. Here, in my opinion, and it still is actually, that at that point, it's interesting to see that it indeed confirms what physicians told us. On the other hand side, we still don't know why. The policy is exactly the same in the three regions, of course. We have national policy for medicines. But still, there is indeed some difference between three of them. On the other hand side, being critical is that a lot of physicians also told us, like, yeah, but in Flanders it must be a lot higher. I'm sure it must be a lot higher. We're doing better. Okay, it's still 60%. It's not very high. So
still twice Wallonia.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's indeed the main argument. But still, it's not the 16% is still at the bottom of the
So it's half of the Netherlands. That's what you're saying.
In general, it's below. It's way below. In Netherlands, they have.
And France? Did you compare with France?
France is an interesting country because they had a similar path as Belgium, also quite some issues in the past, but now they're doing very well as well in terms of biosimilar uptake.
And do you see an impact on Wallonia?
Yeah, we don't have really like longitudinal data. We could really compare like the past with today. So I don't know. Yeah, but it could be an interesting way to look at how our countries interact. But in France, they developed their biosimilar program in 2019. They went for prescriber incentives and also quota into it in the ambulatory care segment. And we've seen the first studies on this, like where they evaluated these policy measures. Those were very successful. So things have changed in France.
And it cannot be due to difference in the population structure, aging, wealth.
Might be, yeah. Those are all hypotheses that we can have, and it's very difficult to know what's exactly behind this.
We could try and see if it's some diseases.
Yeah, agree. We looked into different specialisms. Disease level data we don't have at least in AMI level, unfortunately. But between specialisms, we looked at are there differences, and those were same trends, approximately.
It's not more like vaccination.
No,
AMI is better organized.
but yeah, on vaccination, there is like this regional responsibility also on prevention, so that's different. In for medicines, there is no relationship. So, but it's still for me a question mark why it's happening. We have also had some suggestions here from, for example, physicians and policymakers who told us like, yeah, in Flanders you have a more active physician community promoting biosimilars or talking about biosimilars in conferences, for example, publishing guidelines. Might be one of the reasons, but it's difficult to say, difficult to know what is exactly behind those differences. And the same is true for if we looked at different specialisms. So we looked at specialisms in the ambulatory care, rheumatology, gastroenterology, dermatology, and endocrinology. Also there, I think here the differences are more pronounced because there we do not see any reason why, for example, for diabetes, which are the endocrinologists, why is it so low there and why is it so high for rheumatologists? We can say a lot of people told me, yeah, but there's many shifts happening in diabetes, but it doesn't matter. You look at prescribing rate, biosimilar versus biosimilar plus reference. So those shifts, those are not taken into account here. So it's not a reason why it's happening. So those were, in my opinion, interesting findings, but still to be, let's say, discovered why those differences are happening and why it's so large in the different products. We're talking about not only biosimilars versus reference products, we also looked at shifts, prescribing shifts towards other products. In general, rheumatologists, we see TNF alpha inhibitors, which is the off-patent therapeutic class, I would say, is still dominant, but have declining share over the past couple of years. And there is a shift toward JAK inhibitors, which is a different new class of medicines that have been developed in the past couple of years, or marketed in the past couple of years. There is a shift, but I have to say also here, a lot of physicians and still at conferences, they're talking about this a lot, that the Belgian people say, oh, there's a large shift toward JAK inhibitors. There is a shift, but it's not that outspoken. It's not that large. For example, for gastroenterology and especially for dermatology, shift is way larger, where TNF alpha inhibitors are not dominant anymore for several years. So it's larger. Endocrinologists, and that's very interesting also to see, is that there is a preference among prescribers. Also, when you ask them during interviews and focus groups, there is this preference for second generation insulins. Insulin glargine is the only one in Belgium that has biosimilar competition. There's a lot of insulins on the European market. This is the only one that has biosimilar competition in Belgium. So there it's interesting to see that you have the original formula, less concentrated, you also have a more concentrated that has some advantages for patients. That has been prescribed a lot more and it's really taking over the market. I think it's about 70% of the market is in those more concentrated forms. So therefore, again, the biosimilar, it might be, I would say, even in a scenario where the biosimilar gets 70% of the market, that if that part of the market becomes so small that everyone shifts towards newer products and still doesn't make any sense to really say, yeah, we have this large victory here. So it's not only looking at biosimilar market shares, I would say. And in the third part of the study, so as already mentioned, we developed a model for to guide tendering for healthcare providers in general, to select the best value biological. We came up with 3 different categories. Price is not mentioned here because we specifically looked at what else can you look at besides price. Price is of course important, something that we can look at here. We have 3 different categories of selection criteria. We have product-driven, service-driven, and patient-driven criteria. In general, for product-driven, we noticed that there are several product features that might become important. Resolution rates for hospital pharmacists, storage conditions, for example. There's a lot of differences between products that might be important for hospitals, but also for hospital pharmacists, especially. Indications usually, and I'm not really aware in Belgium of any differences here, but outside of Belgium it does exist. There might be different indications compared to biosimilar versus reference product, especially in second generation products. It might be that they do not have all the indications. So this is important to take into account. Real world experience is something that we are also skeptical to, because the experience of a patent of a biosimilar product will also be less than the originator, because the biosimilar is new into the market. So the real world experience on the market will of course be lower. So that using merely as an argument to choose a product is always difficult. However, we think that, for example, if a product can prove in a real world study that it has less painful injections, that makes a lot of sense, and it's an argument to go for a certain product. So it's a balance here. It should not be I'm longer on the market. That's an argument, no. But if you can prove data that you have benefits towards other products, then it's okay. Service driven, so supply conditions already touched upon, I think. Value added services, environmental sustainability. The two last ones are more difficult, of course, to score. That's something that we know. It's something that was also a challenge when developing the model. Especially on environmental sustainability, we checked this with hospital pharmacists, and I mentioned that they agree that it is important. If, for example, they have stocks very close to Belgium, smaller transportation time, for example, or it's been developed in somewhere in Asia or in the US, it makes some difference for them, and it's difficult to score. It's difficult to say, okay, that's further away, so I should give so many points to that one, so many points to that one. So that's difficult, but it matters. There are some. We also go to the hospital pharmacy conference 2 years ago, and there also this was one of the topics to gain more knowledge into environmental criteria for tendering. So it is something that is rising, but I think there's some challenges to practically implement such kind of criteria. And patient driven, their patient user friendliness already briefly touched upon on real world experience. If you have data on this scientific data, then this is something useful and something to take into account. And also patient support programs might become important.
And then you are giving weights to the various criteria, and then a weight to the price.
Yes, that's the general idea indeed of such a model, and that's also the way how tendering frameworks usually work. Also in Belgium, the main rationale behind this study was, okay, we know that hospital pharmacists want to take into account other elements besides price, but they often do not know which ones or which questions to ask to the developers. So this was, let's say, support. Because, for example, if you have the selection for adalimumab between the biosimilars and the originator one, not all of them will be relevant, but it's at least something to check. Okay, is there a difference in indications in with experience, for example? Something that you can ask and evaluate in the end.
And then do you, I guess it will the producers first announce the technical features of the product and so on, supply condition, and then you ask them to pay penalties if they don't deliver, or
That's difficult. I don't know for sure how that works in detail, but I know that if, like for example, I know that one of the things that we also did here, like for example, in this for supply of products, one of the things that hospital pharmacists did find important was do they have an assistant for urgent deliveries. So that's something that I find important. How to support it is something else, and how to punish them if they don't. That's also something else. Yeah. And in the last part, which I think for me was one of the most interesting ones, we looked at how can we learn from behavioral economics, so a very specific field where we collaborated with other research institutions. And lastly, it was an interesting study on the impact of Belgian policy measures. We looked at what happened in the past and how did this work, or did this work or not, and why.
When you focus on Belgian measures,
Sorry?
why do you focus on Belgian measures?
Because the project was Belgian oriented, because indeed it can also be interesting to look at more the European level and compare different countries, for example. But I think at this point, Minami was mainly interested in what did we do in the past, did that work, what did work, what did not. So it was a Belgian.
But there is no mentality that maybe somebody has done something good somewhere.
There is, but it's I don't think there was, of course, interest because in the beginning of the PhD, we also looked at what happens in other countries. Colleague researchers of mine have done that a lot. But this project was so Belgian focused that indeed we only looked at what happened in the past in Belgium to learn from it. But I agree, and I think also I must also say that there are 3 colleagues now already that have also defended their PhD on biosimilar and off-patent biologicals in general. And they did look a lot more on the European scope. So they drive also learnings from other European countries where things seem to go well. However, it's in this study here, we looked at this more in a quantitative way, where we really looked at how does policy influence biosimilar uptake. Those kind of studies, in my opinion, not yet performed in other countries as well. But it's an interesting way of expanding the scope.
It's something I've observed already a couple of times on completely different fields. But so I remember a discussion with trying to calculate the difficulty to access a school.
Mhm.
And the pushback was, no, in Belgium, distances don't matter. And like, what? But it's quite interesting to see that typically we believe we are an exception to whatever happens in other countries. If you say I have data on the UK, on Germany, yeah, but Belgium is different. And I'm sure that in the other countries the same. So it's quite interesting to see that we don't, we work in an international environment, so we always use all data points. And this is not something that is easy to communicate to national policymakers.
Yeah.
And in Belgium, I trust regional ones either.
But I remember there are so these 3 of my colleagues, they did studies in the UK, in Spain as well, and I think Italy. So there are experiments that have been done also on market data in other countries. But really looking at in a longitudinal way on what happens, let's say between 2006 and today, something like that. So we really look at evolutions over time. I don't think that happened yet, but it's been done, and then there has been a lot of interest in other countries as well. But it should be interesting also to conduct a similar study based on foreign market data. Yeah. So the first part here was on behavioral economics. It was a very specific thing that we looked into. Was more of a general idea that we had because there is this raising interest of behavioral economy on healthcare policy in general, and how can it influence or how can we learn from behavioral economics for pharmaceutical or healthcare policy in general. Very briefly here, what is behavioral economics? It will become clear in the following slide, although it's a complicated field and I will not have the time to explain it all. It's in general, it's at the intersection between psychology on the one hand side, economics, and also neuroscience. It's those 3 fields coming together. And what do I mean by this? On the left-hand side, if you talk about behavioral economics in general, you also have to talk about traditional economics or neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics is most or all of our policies, especially in the pharmaceutical field, are based on traditional economic assumptions, which are that we act consistently rational, consistently meaning that we always act rational. Rational being that rational in general rationality is being defined as we are willing to maximize our interests or maximize our profits. That's the general idea behind that. That it's context independent and that it's stable over time. So our preferences do not change over time. When already saying that might not be the case. Behavioral economics is the field that came at the forefront in the 60s, mainly in the field of marketing. Where they were able to prove that we deviate from these classical assumptions, and even policies that are being developed based on those classical assumptions. They might work, but they might work better if you at least discover or explore different ways in how can we change or can we make these policy measures better when looking at behavioral economics or looking at the fact that we deviate from traditional assumptions there. So our rationality is bounded, that's what they say. The context does matter, and the timing also matters. There are several, that's the general thing on behavioral economics. What they did is they, not only do they say we deviated from classical economic theory in different ways, they also say it's predictable. You can predict in the way we deviate from classical economic assumptions. And this is what they call behavioral biases, being there are different concepts that they already were able to prove in these different predictable ways. We deviate from classical economic theory, And we can learn from this for, in this case, pharmaceutical policy. And that's what we did. We did a literature review on not only what kind of studies are being conducted in the field of pharmaceutical science in general, pharmaceutical policy, on the implementation of behavioral economics on our policy, but also did that work? What's the evidence? That's in fact the main question here of those different concepts. What's the evidence? Does that also apply to pharmaceutical policy? I'm not going into detail on the different behavioral biases that we looked into, but in general, and I will pick one. Defaults, for example, there it's stated that people have a tendency to stick to the default option and choose the path of the least resistance. One of the strongest ways that I've seen this is how it has been implemented in the Netherlands. There was a study that we found where they, as in Belgium also often being done, they have prescribing software for physicians. They have specific tools, a lot of them on the market probably. And there are a lot of them on the market probably. And there you have a list, usually done by a list of different medications. If you say, okay, adalimumab molecule name, a lot of products on the list there, different brands, different populations. And if you say, okay, adalimumab, and in the Netherlands, this is something that I tested. The one that is mentioned first is picked most, just because it's the thing that they see first, and you go for it. In the Netherlands, they changed. For example, they had in alphabetically, I would say, I think that might be the default. Alphabetically, they say, okay, with this product there, we see what happens, but we also make, and that's a control group, and we also make an intervention group where we put a certain product, for example, the cheapest one, can be, or the best value one, we put it, the first one, the first option, and you see what happens. And in those kind of experiments, it's always the case that the new product that you put first on the list is picked most. The market shares increase dramatically if you do that. So those are kind of experiments that really were very interesting to see here. This is something we can apply in Belgium.
So one thing that struck me with the interesting data you showed before, that even within region, across disciplines, so you have the same doctors, I guess they have the same kind of biosimilars, and from what you told me before, the biosimilars perform in the same way as the originators. And so it's really a culture.
Mm-hmm.
In economics, we call that herd behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a few leaders who show me the way, I will follow that way. It doesn't need to be behavioral, just that I don't know how to access information, decipher information. I will follow the rest of the group. And so, and you talked also about culture between Flanders and Wallonia. So it really is that for each subfield, you need to develop a culture of using biosimilars and finding the right. Now we do these things with networks, which escape me a bit, but finding the right people to talk, to diffuse information on a network may have a lot more weight than thinking about social norms, etc.
Yep, I agree, and I think it should be. I think it should be a general thing where indeed those kind of things you should look at.
Juste après que tu l'aies pris.
And there are a lot of differences also between therapeutic areas, for example. So the culture of creating, let's say, a general bubble of trust between certain therapeutic areas, that's indeed one of the things that you should look at. I agree. And this was not the rationale of this study was there is increasing interest in this field. How can we learn from it? But it was also one of the main conclusions of this study. There is still no proof that such applications, for example, towards updating biological policy making, that it works. This was more like an hypothetical exercise, I would say. We just put forward ways, how can we learn from behavioral economics and what kind of evidence exists, but also
the ordering is an obvious candidate, and it's probably right.
That's
So
an obvious candidate. So what it is, we have evidence and to look into the different ones. There are several ways that we developed in the article as well to look into how can we implement behavioral economic perspectives into pharmaceutical policy. For the sake of time, I will not go into detail on all these ones, or I will skip this part for now. But there are several ways, several entry points in how you can in the future look into behavioral economics for pharmaceutical policy making. And in the last study that we conducted, I would like to go quickly over this. We looked at all the different policy measures that have been implemented in the past. Do they work for Belgium? They work. What was the average impact? How do we do this? So we looked at those specific methods for this. It's an economic modeling way, ARIMA modeling. You look at the trends in biosimilar evolution or biosimilar uptake before certain policy intervention. You can predict what would have happened without the intervention, and you compare this to what did happen in reality, which was in the presence of the intervention. So that's what we did, actual trend comparing to the Hict trend in the model. Two main conclusions here. There was a small negative effect. So we in fact picked 3 different molecules where we have enough data over time. You need enough data points before the intervention, but also after the intervention. That's the reason why only a few molecules were in scope of this research. More recently introduced molecules are not possible here.
And so you use the whole set of molecules to calculate your prediction.
We used the whole set of different products for a certain molecule. So for example, etanercept has 3.
But to identify an intervention, intervention will target a market, I guess.
Yes, yeah. The interventions are the ones that we listed up front. What are the things that have been implemented in Belgium to promote competition? And then we looked at, okay, how can we distinguish different ones over time and to see what happens before and afterwards. So it was being done.
It's your control group that I don't understand. How do you?
It's always the difficulty of policy research is that you don't have a control group.
Exactly.
We did not have a control group here, and that's the methodology was in a way that it does not, you don't need a control group because you predict what would have happened without the intervention based on the data before the intervention. So there is no control. That's part of the technique.
Why don't you use EU market data then?
Because then you have to take into account for different countries as well. In other countries, it might be that there are other confounding factors. The larger you take your scope, the more confounding factors might influence the results also here. It might be, for example, that if you, in Belgium, we have information campaign in 2018 that we looked at, for example. If you look at, for example, UK data, might be that even afterwards, they have a lot of other interesting things that happen into the markets or a lot of other policy intervention that might have influenced the trend of their molecules. And also, if you look at other markets, it might be that the market is already saturated. It might be that, for example, other countries are already performing very well. So the trend there is difficult to observe. You have to compare to countries comparable to Belgium, which is difficult to find. But in general, we found for 3 different molecules. Financial incentive that was done in 2018, prescriber incentive, where basically they provided an amount of money to physicians that prescribed a certain percentage of biosimilars. And so we checked, I think this worked, and there was even a negative impact. The measure, which not really surprised us because also in the interviews in focus group physicians mentioned that they did not like the intervention at all. So it really was not that surprising, but still interesting to see. For the hospital products in general, positive effect of the information campaign I was mentioned, and also the circular letter done by the ministry to promote fair tendering. But other policy measures that have been implemented in the past did not have any significant effect. But not a significant negative, just no effect observable. To give, I don't have much time for this, but to see, for example, here, apoetine. There you can see the lines are the intervention points that we looked at, and the dots are the number of biosimilars in that period of time. So there you can see for the first intervention, you can visually see that there's a larger uptake, so it's increasing. For the second line, you can also visually see that, okay, apparently the biosimilar volumes have been increasing after the second intervention as well. And then generally, this is my final slide of the presentation. We came up with 7, if I'm not mistaken, different areas where we think the policy framework should go to. Each of them has, let's say, co-measures or sub-measures that we have described into detail on how we should move forward with our policy framework. So first of all, we think that there is an holistic, proactive, and multi-stakeholder policy framework needed. One of the parts here was indeed to implement a best value biological working group where indeed different stakeholders should come together and advise policymakers. Publicly, information should be up to date. It's not the case now. A lot of information is outdated or not reaching the target being physicians and patients, for example. We should continue educational investments, both for patients and healthcare providers, as we've seen that that's still needed. We should optimize the Belgian tendering landscape, but I have to say this is something that is outdated here because this is there is some changes in the legislation that happened a couple of months ago. We should tailor the support for transitioning biosimilars in ambulatory care, meaning we should help or we should support physicians when they're transitioning from originator biological with their patient towards biosimilar, for example. They should be able to guide their patient. They should get the right incentive to do that. We should fine-tune the reimbursement framework, which was also mentioned earlier on. And lastly, we believe this is one of the main findings of the research also, there is a performance information system needed because, for example, indication-specific data is something that we lack. Longitudinal data following patients over time. Some are simply data we asked this to receive during the project, but they disappointed us by telling us that it's not available in Belgium. So I think it's needed.
But the performance information system, as well as with the tailored support transition to biosimilars, could be put under the holistic, not the stakeholder policy frame. No,
Yes, to some extent, yes. Yeah,
they could have the authority to do so. The board to
of course, yeah.
Okay.
They're all interrelated indeed. It's not something is completely, they're all codependent. Yeah, fully agree.
I see Michel wants to make a comment. Michel?
Yes, well, first of all, this was very, very interesting. I think it was very real comprehensive review of the problem. I have just one question or remark, because when we talk about competition, there are two levels of competition. It's the biosimilar with the native molecule. And as you alluded to, there is the competition related to the fact that new products appear on the market, possibly more efficient than the original molecule and the biosimilar. And in your presentation, sometimes I was a bit confused. For example, when you give percentage of biosimilar uptake, is it by comparison with the native molecule or with the regular product, or is it a general percentage of the prescription for a given indication?
Usually, and I think in this presentation, this was only done in this way, it's indeed a percentage of the native molecule. I agree that there is indeed competition on two levels, biosimilar versus originator, but as mentioned, also between both biosimilar and originator and newer molecules coming into the market. And that's also why we looked at shifts with the percentages on biosimilar uptake. Those are biosimilar versus native molecule.
Okay, thank you. But perhaps just one additional remark. I think that many things might change with the current development, well, especially in India and South Africa, of new manufacturing product, which will make indeed the production of biosimilar much less expensive. So I don't know what will be the impact in our countries, but we should really be aware of this. And in Belgium, we have a very good example with Universals and José Castillo. For those who are interested, there was a very good TV show recently about him, and he was explaining the new technologies he is developing, especially for mRNA products, but this might be applied to other products. Actually, he already applied this to the polio vaccine. So it's just a remark. We will see what will be the impact, but I think it's important that we keep this in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yep, agree.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you, Dr. Vandenplas. Yannick, thank you so much. Well, my both colleagues has unfortunately had to leave, but congratulated you, and I needed to do so on their behalf. I wanted to directly interact with you on several points you made. I think we all enjoyed your talk, particularly because it's really at the heart of what we also search for at I3h, really affordable access to medicine and bringing affordable drugs to the market. So I think you really presented a very nice overview of the work you did throughout your PhD at KU Leuven, but I really hope that you, well, I saw that several manuscripts were in preparation and eager to read them already, because I think it's really valuable for our work too. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and I hope there are no questions left online. In any case, we will transfer them to you and stay in contact.
Yes.
Yes, Hannah, yes, please. Very quickly then.
Sorry, very quickly, sorry. Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I've been lately working on the questions of repurposing, and actually I'd like to know your point of view about how do you see the role of repurposed biosimilars and actually their original biologics in achieving long-term sustainability in the Belgian off-patent biologicals market. It's quite rare compared to the repurposing of a traditional pharmaceuticals, but I have in mind biosimilars that have been repurposed, like rituximab or trastuzumab for cancer mainly. So, yeah, please, thank you.
Yes, I think that's something that could become important in the future as well. I would mainly say as the first reaction that the experience with repurposing for biologicals is very limited. I'm indeed not aware of any other examples, like rituximab was the one I was also thinking of, that's being used to that extent. To be honest, I think that as soon as those kind of things can also happen for biologicals, and I think there again, it's the one thing that I would warrant is that repurposing, a lot of research has already been done on generic repurposing or traditional medicines repurposing. The thing that I learned from the research here is that maybe we did not look enough back. Let's say we did not look enough into the history of, for example, generics. A lot of people told me during the research, yeah, we have implemented policy measures for competition in biological medicines, but we already learned from generics that didn't work. Why are we doing it again? Why are we doing it the wrong way again? Why don't we learn from the past traditional medicines? We've seen it. So I would mainly say that if at the point, and I'm not aware of any other potential candidates in biological medicines for repurposing, I would say that as soon as that becomes really important in biologicals, we should really look at generics and how we can learn from the traditional medicines part on how to implement it in the right way. But indeed, for rituximab, that's the only one that I'm aware of. So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yannick, for answering that last comment. Indeed, it's really, as I already explained, at the heart of what several of our researchers do. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for all of those who stayed online. Thank you. And yeah, we hope to see you after New Year. We wish you a happy family time and a healthy New Year. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.